So you have $100 to spend on your next gaming graphics card. So could this be the GPU that you should pick up? Nvidia's GTX 1660 Ti was their budget offering 5 years ago. But in 2024, should you consider one of these GPUs or look elsewhere? To find out, I've tested this at 1080p. 5 years ago, Nvidia launched the 1660 Ti as their budget Turing offering. Lacking the RTX features like DLSS and ray tracing, this made this GPU quite a lot cheaper than its RTX bigger brothers. This thing only costed $279 at its MSRP, and pair this with the fact that its 1080p and even 1440p gaming performance was quite good back then. A lot of gamers would have picked one of these up. A lot of goodies from the RTX graphics cards did trickle down into this GTX GPU with the new and improved Turing encoder at the time, so it's an excellent choice for gameplay recording and streamers, and also it's very efficient even in 2024, as it only requires a single 8-pin like the RTX 3050. So when Nvidia put all of these into one graphics card, it did make it a very compelling buy back then. But 5 years on, in 2024, how does it get on? To find out, I've tested it at 1080p in my testing PC, which has a Ryzen 5 7600, 32GB of DDR5 memory clocked at 6200 MHz CL32, a 2TB NVMe Gen 4 SSD, built on an MSI X670E Tomahawk motherboard. The GPU has been left at its stock out of the box settings, and all testing has been done using driver version 555.99. So without any more talking, let's get straight into it. Starting off with a title that's very hard to run in Jedi Survivor, and here, in all fairness, on the medium preset, the 1660 Ti didn't do too badly. With just under 50 frames per second on average, and the 1% low was above 30 FPS, meaning you're going to get a somewhat playable experience. But if you wanted to play Jedi Survivor on this graphics card, I'd recommend doing some settings tweaking, as this will get you a much better frame rate in my opinion. Or alternatively, maybe pick up a more powerful GPU for this very unoptimized title. Conversely, Spider-Man Remastered is a very optimised title, thus the 1660 Ti gets on quite well here. Just ducking 90 FPS on average, and the 1% low was not the greatest in the world, but as we know, web slinging does tank that 1% low, but it's not that much of a problem because regular gameplay is going to be totally fine on the 1660 Ti in Spider-Man Remastered, so I wouldn't worry here. For your esports games, you're going to be totally set with competitive frame rates, because in Fortnite on the DirectX 11 API, you're good enough for 300 FPS on average, and the 1% low by Fortnite standards is looking very good, just under 200 frames per second. If you had a 360Hz monitor or above, you could probably go with the Performance API, and the 1660 Ti has certainly got the horsepower right there. Cyberpunk on the medium preset performed very well today, getting above 60 frames per second on average, with a decent 1% low as well, but thanks to Cyberpunk not being that VRAM intensive at rasterized 1080p, you can enable the high textures, which is what I did today. So the game does look relatively decent on the medium preset with the high textures enabled, and with a 1660 Ti and this performance, I mean, there's not really that much to complain about. The performance here is pretty good on this old GPU. F123 on the medium preset gets what I like to call acceptable performance for a racing game, as I usually aim for 120 frames per second on average, which is what the 1660 Ti got more than today. I'd say this is brilliant performance. Also, the frame pacing is great with that 1% low there, so you don't really have any issues in F123. If you was after more frame rate, the low or very low presets would also be a very good option here. Hogwarts Legacy on the medium preset isn't really that much of a challenge for this old graphics card, because way more than 60 FPS on average with a somewhat decent 1% low by Hogwarts Legacy standards means the 1660 Ti is perfectly fine in this title. You might even be able to get away with a high preset here, but you would probably be dropping below 60 FPS on average. So I recommend doing some settings tweaking, and you could get a very good gaming experience from this title. Starfield today is up last, and on graphics cards older than the 30 series, which the 1660 Ti is, you're not going to be getting very good performance at all, because 46 FPS on the low preset is not acceptable in my opinion, and this is, well, not very good at all. You could always enable FSR free frame generation, that is an option here, and that should get you above 60 FPS easily, but its frame generation, it may implement some input lag, so that is a potential downside there. But if you wanted to know, Starfield is playable on a 1660 Ti. It certainly is, but it's not the most brilliant experience in the world. So across the board in the games tested today, if you consider the price, the 1660 Ti has been putting out some pretty decent performance. I'm going to start off with the esports games, as that's what I primarily recommend this graphics card for. And good news, you're going to be set for a 240Hz or even a 360Hz competitive gaming experience in these titles. With Fortnite, Counter-Strike 2 and Rainbow Six Siege performing brilliantly today, I feel safe to recommend this graphics card for other esports titles as well, like Valorant and even Rocket League and those sorts of titles. I'm confident in saying this graphics card is going to be totally fine in them. And if you look at these titles as well, the 6GB of VRAM isn't going to be a problem in them because they use like 2 or 3GB of video memory, which really isn't going to be a problem at 1080p for this graphics card. And the reason why I say that is because in 2024, 6GB of video memory really isn't enough for 1080p gaming. If you wanted to enable textures on ultra or even high, you might be running into issues, especially in games like Jedi Survivor, where we had to set it to the medium preset today, and I was very concerned with the VRAM on this graphics card. If you had something like a GTX 1070 with 8GB of VRAM, or even an RTX 3050 which has very similar performance to this, I'd recommend enabling high or ultra textures, as from what it seems, 8GB isn't really an issue at rasterized 1080p. And the medium preset is what I recommend for most AAA games on the 1660 Ti, as it doesn't really have the horsepower for high presets, unless if you're alright with 30 FPS, I suppose you could probably get away with a high preset there, if you don't run into VRAM problems with the 6GB. But in the case of Starfield, you will be stuck to the low preset. Here, the performance just wasn't great, as this title doesn't seem optimised for Turing and older GPUs for some reason. So that's something you've got to keep in mind. And yeah, the performance in Starfield really wasn't great on this GPU. But if you're a fan of PlayStation first-party titles, you're in luck, because God of War and Spider-Man ran on the high preset today with more than 60 frames per second on the 1660 Ti. So if you want to play those titles, performance at 1080p is totally fine on this GPU. And that's why I recommend this graphics card for esports titles first, AAA titles second, because it's certainly got the performance to justify its price in competitive titles, getting more than 200 or 300 frames per second there, but it's also got enough power to somewhat play more demanding AAA titles. Yes, you will be setting them to undesirable settings like the medium preset, and you might not be getting desirable frame rates, but you can at least start them, and the 6GB of VRAM isn't really enough in 2024 for these games, but it's enough to at least get them started without any major problems. And in the case of Starfield, if you want to play that, or even Jedi Survivor for that matter, I do recommend a much more newer and slightly more powerful graphics card for those. Maybe something like the RX 6600, that might be a good one for you. But back to the 1660 Ti, and I think this is an excellent budget GPU if you wanted to kickstart a streaming or YouTube career. Because of the Turing encoder, which is still quite good in 2024, you will be getting superior recording and stream quality, which is always a bonus, isn't it? Also, this GPU is actually pretty efficient. It only consumed around 124 watts in my testing, which is about 35 more than the RTX 3050, and that had an undervolt as well, so it doesn't really consume that much power. And as long as you've got a power supply with a PCIe 8-pin, you're going to be good to go. There is one problem about this graphics card though, and that is the 1660 Super. For some reason, this GPU goes for a lot cheaper than the Ti model for some reason, and it's only about 3% behind it, so it's not really going to be noticeable. So that is the graphics card I probably would recommend over this. But if you can find a 1660 Ti for around the same price, or like $5 more or something like that, I'd say it's certainly worth it. But one thing I can say for certain though is, don't get the RTX 3050, as it will be getting very similar performance to this GPU with a $50 markup. Granted, it does have 8GB of VRAM and the RTX feature set, so it's got DLSS and stuff like that, but it costs the same as an RX 6600, which is a much powerful graphics card than this, and the RTX 3050, so its value isn't really there. And if you want to see how that GPU gets on, there's a video for it right up there, and I'll catch you in the next one.